Hello everyone, the third week of the Genshin 5.3 beta has begun, and typically the third week is when we see the most major changes to character kits, and this patch's beta is no different. Significant updates were made to all 4 of the new characters coming in patch 5.3. Both Mavuika and Citlali got some pretty sizable nerfs, especially Mavuika, while Pyro Traveler and Lan Yan got some pretty nice buffs. So I wanted to cover all the important kit changes that were made and analyze how these changes affect each character's current overall strength. Let's start off with the character who got the majority of the massive changes this patch, Mavuika. To give some context, Mavuika's initial kit was, to put it simply, very strong. In terms of her off-field capabilities, she doesn't have as much pyro application as Xiangling does. However, not all teams require Xiangling's level of pyro application, so even though Mavuika isn't a complete Xiangling replacement, in teams where Mavuika's pyro application is sufficient enough, Mavuika is a Xiangling upgrade because she brings more personal damage, mainly from her elemental burst, on top of team damage buffs from her burst and 4-piece scroll. On top of that, you don't have to worry about any energy requirements from Mavuika's off-field pyro application. But while Mavuika's off-field capabilities is pretty good, it is massively overshadowed by her on-field capabilities. With Mavuika's original kit, her damage as a main DPS was extremely high. From all the early TC calcs I've seen, her team damage was far ahead of any other DPS in the game. The numbers she was putting out were just insane, so pretty much everyone was expecting her main DPS numbers to get nerfed. And this is exactly what happened this week. Mavuika got some very significant nerfs to her main DPS potential. First, the multipliers of her motorcycle charged attacks were decreased, both the normal circling attack and the final slash. All the sheets I've seen use 8 cyclic attacks and 1 finisher to calc her damage, so these multiplier nerfs are a clear hit to her main DPS damage combo. On its own, it's 200 less motion value with this charge attack combo per rotation, but that's not all. Mavuika's elemental burst increased the damage of her normal and charge attacks in her motorcycle form based on how much fighting spirit she consumed to use her burst. Remember that fighting spirit is generated when your team performs normal attacks or consumes night soul points. This damage buff was reduced as well. Assuming you always burst with the max of 200 fighting spirit, Mavuika is losing an additional 700 motion value on her main DPS charge attack combo. In total, she loses about 900 motion value every rotation with the nerf, which is quite significant. However, Mavuika received even more minor nerfs in her passives. For her A1, the attack Mavuika receives after Night Soul Burst is triggered was reduced from 35% to 30%. For her A4, the maximum damage buff Mavuika is able to give to the active character was reduced from 50% to 40%. Ultimately, these are just some smaller nerfs to the C0 kit for both on-field and off-field Mavuika, but nerfs nonetheless. Lastly, in terms of constellations, Mavuika C2 was nerfed to give less base attack and less damage bonus to her normal attacks, charged attacks, and elemental burst damage. This nerf is definitely understandable as her C2 was extremely strong, especially because of the base attack increase. And even with the nerf, it is still Mavuika's best constellation. And C4 now additionally increases the damage bonus Mavuika can give to the active character by 10%. So they nerfed her damage buff from her A4 by 10%, but put that 10% back into her C4. So I threw all these numbers around, but how do these nerfs affect Mavuika's performance? Ultimately, Mavuika's off-fielding was relatively unaffected, but her personal damage as a main DPS decreased by about 15 to 20%, which is a pretty big nerf. If you were around for Maulani's beta, Maulani's scenario is very similar to this one. Originally, Maulani had very high numbers and then she was massively nerfed. Same type of thing is going on here. However, despite this being a significant nerf to Mavuika's damage, Mavuika's main DPS damage is still top tier. There are 2 main reasons for this. First, a lot of Mavuika's damage comes from the cast of her elemental burst. It has an extremely high multiplier, and if you trigger a reaction like vaporize or melt with it, it deals a ton of damage. Thus, Mavuika's burst damage itself makes up a large part of her damage profile, and her burst multiplier wasn't touched at all at C0 with these nerfs. And second, as I mentioned before, Mavuika's damage as a main DPS was extremely high with her original numbers, so even with this 15 to 20% damage nerf, the damage of her teams are still quite high. From the early TC calcs that I've seen, Mavuika is now slightly better than Arlecchino in terms of team damage as opposed to being very ahead of Arlecchino with her original numbers. So Mavuika's numbers are now more in line with DPS that we currently have, but she still has teams that have arguably the highest damage in the game, on top of having large AoE, front-loaded damage, and inherent resistance to interruption. A lot of people compare Mavuika and Arlecchino as power main DPSs, and even despite what I just said, I don't think that Mavuika is a complete Arlecchino pyro creep. Mavuika does rely on reaction-based comps like Vape and Melt for those high numbers that she's putting out, and she really wants units like Citlali and Xilonen on her team for fighting spirit generation. In contrast, Arlecchino will generally perform perform better with unreacted damage, so she's still very good in teams like Mono Pyro and Chivalrous Overload, making Arlecchino more versatile in team building. Overall, Mavuika definitely deserved these nerfs to her main DPS damage, as even with the nerfs, she is still arguably looking like the best DPS in the game. The one thing I don't like with these beta changes is the nerf to her off-fielding capabilities with her A4 damage buff nerf. When a lot of Mavuika's strength is being put into her main DPS abilities, I don't really see a point in bringing down her other playstyle as well. I do hope off-field Mavuika gets a buff, though it is clear that Hoyo is intending her design to lean towards being primarily a main DPS. Next, let's talk about Citlali, as she also got some significant nerfs to her kit. First, Citlali's skill will now briefly apply cryo to herself. I'm not sure why Hoyoverse decided to add this, but in my opinion, this will be a negative change. If any of you have played Xingqiu, you know that if you're affected by cryo and you press his skill, he'll get frozen since he applies hydro to himself with his skill, so it gets annoying when you have to unfreeze yourself. This scenario will happen to Citlali if you are affected by hydro and you use her skill now. Not the biggest deal overall, but it will be annoying when the scenario comes up. However, the biggest nerf to happen is to Citlali's A4 passive. The EM scaling given to her elemental burst was halved from 2400% to 1200% of Citlali's EM. Citlali's burst was the majority of her damage as a support, and ideally you wanted to melt this burst so Citlali could do a single big nuke of damage. So having the EM multiplier nerfed by half is a pretty big hit to her personal damage. Other than that, Citlali's C4 was buffed to deal more damage and now additionally restores 8 energy for Citlali, and Citlali's C6 was changed from being able to give the team extra cryo damage bonus along with pyro and hydro damage to now just giving Citlali herself damage bonus along with the team pyro and hydro damage buff, removing the cryo buff altogether. Clearly, Citlali is a cryo character that is designed to not directly buff other cryo characters. Overall, Citlali's personal damage took a pretty big hit, which is unfortunate. However, ultimately, Citlali's own damage isn't that important with her role as a support. Her shield, res shred to pyro and hydro, access to 4-piece scroll, and her off-field cryo application are really what make her strong, and these aspects weren't touched. Thus, even with the nerf to her burst damage, Citlali is still a very strong support in her teams. Now let's go over the changes made to Pyro Traveler. Pyro MC did get some multiplier changes to both the skill and burst, but the damage from these abilities weren't that important in Pyro MC's role as a support, and the number changes themselves aren't that big anyways. The main significant buff is that Pyro MC's skill now has an 18-second cooldown. Originally, it was 20 seconds. This is amazing since Pyro MC's burst cooldown is 18 seconds, so it was really awkward to have the two abilities have desynced cooldowns. With the original 20-second cooldown, it was actually recommended to run Sacrificial Sword just to have the cooldowns aligned. Now you don't have to worry about that anymore, as everything has an 18-second cooldown, which is a great quality of life for Pyro Traveler. In addition, the extra damage bonus that Pyro Traveler C1 gives to characters in Night Soul's Blessing was increased from an additional 6% to an additional 9%. So an extra 3% damage to natlan characters with Pyro MC on the team. Very small buff, but hey, a buff is a buff. Also, in this beta, all of Pyro Traveler's constellations additional effects got a buff, but as a reminder, Pyro Traveler's additional effects in their constellations are only activated during the story or when you fight the new weekly boss. So even though all of these were buff, it isn't really relevant. Lastly, Lan Yan really only got one relevant kit change, but it is a pretty good buff. Her shield duration is being increased from 8 seconds to 12.5 seconds. While Lan Yan's shield is decently strong, her original shield duration was one of the biggest issues with her kit, as her skill has a 16-second cooldown. So without sacrificial fragments or her C6, there is an 8-second downtime on her shield, which wouldn't feel very good to play. But now, a shield duration of 12.5 seconds is much more manageable, as even at C0, the shield only has 3.5 seconds of downtime. A great quality of life buff to her kit, making her an even stronger animal shielder. The other change she got was that her special passive was added. It's the ability to not scare animals like crystal flies when walking near them. Not combat or meta relevant, but I know people do appreciate overworld passives like this one. And those were all the significant updates from the third week of the Genshin 5.3 beta. If I could give a simple one-sentence TLDR, it would be that Mavuika as a main DPS got some significant nerfs, but she's still looking like one of the best DPSs in the game. Citlali's burst damage was nerfed, but it doesn't really matter because all of her support capabilities are the same, so she's still pretty strong. Pyro MC got a nice quality of life buff with the skill cooldown, and Lan Yan got a nice buff to her shield duration. Remember that there are a couple of weeks remaining for this beta, so any character's kit can change even more. I hope this update and analysis video was in any way helpful. If you enjoyed, don't be shy and like the video or sub to the channel to be informed about all the upcoming news about any major Genshin beta updates, as well as pre-release guides and explanations for any upcoming Genshin characters. And with that, I hope you all have a wonderful day.